Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is back injuries and how to prevent them. Believe it or not, a lot of people are suffering their very first back injury after playing pickleball. That's because this is America's fastest growing sport. Take a look at why it's catching on like wildfire. Over the last few years, pickleball has become the rage, especially among older Americans looking for something they can do that's good for the body and mind.
Pickleball is very addictive. It's like a wonderful drug to me. I love it. I love it. I can't get enough of it.
Folks of all ages are thrilled to discover something so healthy is also really fun.
I meet lots of new people all the time, and I have found that it has helped me lose weight after knee replacement from gaining a little bit of weight, and just really keep in shape physically, keep my strength up, keep my core strong. So I've really gotten a lot of benefit out of it.
Although pickleball looks like tennis, there's less wear and tear on the joints.
The size of the court is 1/3 the size of a tennis court, so we don't have to move as much side to side, back and forth. So that in itself makes it easier on your overall body.
The game is slower than tennis and easier to pick up.
Pickleball being the fastest growing sport in the world is because almost anybody can play this sport and have a great time.
Like all sports, injuries are possible. Strains or tears in the feet, back, and shoulder are the most common, especially among older folks. Experts recommend people talk to their doctor before starting a new activity and warming up before hitting the court. Pickleball was invented in 1960s Seattle by two guys who wanted to play badminton but only had the net. So they improvised using equipment from other sports, ping pong paddles and a wiffle ball. The name pickleball comes from pickle boat, from crew, which uses oarsmen from other boats. Pickleball surged in popularity during the COVID-19 pandemic as people searched for ways to exercise outside while keeping their distance. Health experts say pickleball offers many of the same brain benefits as ping pong, a sport doctors recommend to help reduce cognitive decline, largely due to the constant hand-eye coordination.
And you're adding that cardio factor so that you're, pumping the blood to your brain, which we know is very good for cognition.
Pickleball can also improve reflexes.
It forces you to react quickly, to make decisions quickly, and it puts you in a new situation every time the ball is served.
Many players say the social element is what keeps them coming back.
And that's the part that I like, that it's very sociable. So you can laugh and joke and clown around and have a good time with people, and nobody really takes you too seriously.
Which is also good for the brain.
Being around other people and meeting new people and being social has been shown to be a really important lifestyle factor in preventing dementia.
Exercise can help us sleep better, and vitamin D from sun exposure can improve our mood. So while trying a new sport can be intimidating, especially if you've been on the bench for a while, pickleball can be easy, fun, and very healthy, regardless of age. And joining me now is spine surgeon Dr. Colin Haines with the Virginia Spine Institute, and I should point out, an avid pickleball player. Dr. Haines, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
We saw that pickleball is catching on like crazy. Why is it that people are becoming injured?
There's no doubt about it. Pickleball is taking off. It's a great sport. It's a lot of fun. As you said, I play myself. But you're correct. We are seeing people getting injured more and more commonly, largely because not only is it taking off like crazy, but we aren't taking the sport seriously enough. It's a real sport. And with that come real risks.
So what types of injuries are people suffering from?
So speaking from personal experience, I grew up playing tennis. I work out. I thought I was in shape and still think I am. But I went off and played pickleball for the first time. I didn't warm up. I played for about 3 hours. I could barely walk the next day. My back and my legs were so sore. So really got to be cognizant that this is a true sport. You got to warm up properly. You got to cool down properly. But there are specific risks to the back. What I felt was kind of, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor. It was muscle soreness. I didn't tune my body up enough. But we are seeing people with more serious injuries, and specifically with the spine. A lot of times it's coming from the low back, the lumbar discs, we call them, or the shock absorbers. They help allow our spines to move, but also protect our spines.
So you look like the picture of health. I can't believe that you were injured because, when I was shooting this story, I met a lot of people who are, not spring chickens anymore, and they haven't exercised for a while. And yet mentally, they still feel like they're in their 20s and can still do the things that they used to do when they were in their 20s and become injured that way. So a lot of it is sort of realizing, hello, you've gotten a little bit older, right?
Weekend warrior syndrome, we call it. We have to be cognizant of our bodies. I'm aging as well. I've 3 wonderful kids at home who make me older by the day. So there's a lot of truth we got to deal with this very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that we see, I'm sure you do too, as a spine surgeon, across the board with people, where people who are older and they get out there and they shovel snow and they're really not in that great of shape and they start getting injured. So I guess the first thing also is to kind of do a reality check and take a sort of temperature check of how much exercise you've been doing recently, right?
I think being very honest and cognizant with ourselves is important when we're talking about doing any activity. With that being said, I want people to still live the lives they want. I encourage my patients who haven't had surgery, those who have had surgery, live the life you want. My example, I have a patient who's a MMA fighter, and he had surgery and he's back to fighting in MMA. Now, that being said, he's very smart about his spine, as smart as he can be, but it's important that we do live the lives we want. I think that philosophically, we want to keep doing what we enjoy for longer. So this is all very achievable. Just some things that we have to do to our bodies and preparation to make sure that we can keep doing that.
So how important is, for example, stretching?
It's big time. I'm a big fan of stretching before, the warm-up before, and the cool down after. So I call it a 5-5 rule. And what I mean by that, 5 minutes of warm-up, 5 minutes of cool down. Now, delving a little bit more into the specifics, I like to split up each session into half, just getting the muscles flowing with a little bit of walking, some jumping jacks, something just to get the blood pumping, and the other half to stretch and get your body ready.
So you want to actually raise your body temperature a little bit before you start stretching. So maybe do a little bit of running in place or jumping jacks, like you said, and then stretch the muscle.
Yep. So that's how I warm up. You get the blood pumping, then stretch. And on the back end, when you're doing the cool down, stretch, and then you do the walking or the jumping jacks on the back end.
Oh, okay. So, and then what types of stretches should we be doing? Sometimes when I stretch, I feel like the stretches might hurt my back.
Yeah, it's doing it in the proper manner. I think that for the most part, people, when we think stretching, we jump straight to the hamstrings. We see people bending over and stretching out the hamstrings. We think of the calves, and those are critically important. With that being said, we want to make sure we don't neglect the spine. When it comes to the spine or muscles in general, the way we think about muscles is they're protective. If your muscles are working properly, they offload the work that your spine and your bones and joints have to do. So importantly, there are 3 exercises and stretches that I like to do before we really get into pickleball with respect to the back. 1, just simple cat-cows where you're arching forward and leaning backwards. 1 where you're doing simple twists side to side. And the last one, really focusing on the upper part of the back, stretching and pulling those lat muscles and holding for a couple of seconds.
Oh, that's great advice. I've seen people do that actually out on the pickleball court. All right, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Colin Haines, spine surgeon with Virginia Spine Institute, to now talk about what we can do while we're actually playing the game to help prevent against those back injuries. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living, and we are continuing our discussion with Dr. Colin Haines, who is a spine surgeon with Virginia Spine Institute. We're talking about sports and how to prevent sports injuries, specifically pickleball injuries, because so many people are getting into pickleball, and folks who haven't really exercised a lot lately in particular. So we talked about the importance of stretching to help prevent back injuries. What do we do once we get on the court to stay safe?
Well, preparation is critical. Fortunately, I can give you some tips of the mistakes that I've made myself. But believe it or not, when I first started playing pickleball, because I just started getting into the sport, I was using running shoes. I mean, it's amazing the difference proper footwear can make. What I noticed when I was wearing my running shoes, so they're designed for forward and backwards, but really not the side-to-side cutting that pickleball requires. My shoes ripped. The shoes aren't designed to tolerate that side-to-side motion. So not only did my shoes rip, and I think that was a trigger for me to say, okay, time to, get smart and buy some real equipment. But also once I started wearing tennis or, pickleball shoes, essentially the same thing, the stability I felt with my ankles was tremendous. So not only was the equipment functioning appropriately, I actually could notice the tangible difference. So comes down to the equipment, I think, is a wonderful way to start.
And what about form, the way you play?
A lot of times we create these contrasts between tennis and pickleball. And one of the things that I noticed myself is that with pickleball, the racket's really short. So a simple way to pick up a ball with tennis, you got a long racket. You squeeze the ball against your foot with your racket and you lift it up as one. Different ball game when it comes to pickleball. There's a lot of bending forward to pick that ball up. Making sure you use good posture when you're bending forward is critical. What you don't want to do is you don't want to round your back and arch over like this too much. That puts some additional force on the discs, the shock absorbers in the spine. And while most of the time the body tolerates it just fine, that's a position that puts your back at a little bit of risk. So instead, using the old adage, bend with the knees, bend with the hips, and keeping your back nice curvature upward, keeping that proper posture, that's really safest for your back when you're picking the ball up.
So any other advice during the game? Because I'm sure you've got tips on what to do afterwards besides stretching.
Yeah, don't kill the ball. That was a big contrast that I noticed compared to tennis. When I'm playing net in tennis, you can oftentimes win the point by using power. Well, the ball in and of itself just doesn't go that fast. It's much more of a control thing. So when I first started playing, I was trying to kill the ball. I was really swinging very hard. Actually, too much force, too much of an aggressive twist at the waist. That does risk the back. So not only does it make you better at pickleball when you're just using your angles and using more gentle form, but it's safer for your body as well when you're not trying to overhit.
Oh, that's really good advice because it's kind of a wiffle ball. So, you don't need all that force to get it to go. Anything else as far as, when you're playing, how to protect your back?
Well, I like to start slowly. I start playing in the kitchen. You don't want to go and start swinging the racket really hard to try to, again, connect with the ball with too much velocity. Start slow, work yourself into the kitchen initially, and then step back to the baseline, do some actual hits.
Mm-hmm. And regarding once the game is finished, you talk about stretching. What else can people do off the court?
And so really taking a nice cool down walk. Take some laps. Not only is it good and social and good for your mental and emotional health, but it's really good to let the muscles cool down properly. It's like, if you're driving a car 0 to 60, you're supposed to slow down as you drive it on the back and you just don't stop immediately. The same thing with the human body.
Mm-hmm. So obviously a lot of these tips translate into other sports injuries. And now that we're getting into the summertime sports, I'm sure you see a lot of sports injuries. Can you give us some broader tips on how to prevent them, not just for pickleball players, but for everybody?
Well, I think my sports injuries are going to come from lugging my kids' equipment to the pool all summer. But with that being said, that's something to think about. Equipment can be heavy, and take a couple trips. I did that yesterday. I'm bringing my stuff, my kids' equipment home from the pool, and I took 2 trips. I used proper form. I kept the equipment close to my chest, and I just didn't go quite as heavy and took a couple extra steps. So for me, that was a wonderful preventative thing that I was able to do. A lot of the other summer activities, swimming clearly is a big one. I'm a big fan of swimming in general for kids and adults. It's wonderful for the core. So making sure you're picking the proper type of exercise is really important. And then also knowing your limits. Don't expect if you're going to go running for the first time that you're going to run a marathon. You don't have to keep up with the person who's been running for the last 10 years. Slow and steady really does win the race.
Talk about the importance of diving correctly and properly.
It's huge. Fortunately, we don't see this too often, but some injuries happen when people don't acknowledge the depth of the water. Making sure that if you're diving, it's the proper depth. Don't go diving in the kiddie pool, and really double check and test the depth before you jump in. Then, of course, when you're jumping in, absolutely form is critical. If you hit the water too hard, it actually, even though it's just water, just transmits some force to the spine. So making sure you're cutting through the water with the proper diving form once you've established the depth is appropriate is really, really important.
And so if you're in a lake or something, a lot of times you can't really see how deep it is wherever you're planning to dive, right?
Correct. I mean, I'm sure most of us hear these, 1 in a million terrible, sad stories about friend of a friend who broke their spine because they dove into shallow water. It's critical. I mean, that's probably the single most important thing is know your water depth before you even contemplate jumping in.
Yeah, I remember. I kind of shudder to think about some of the cliffs that I used to dive off of when I was much younger, and we couldn't see. We just assumed the water was deep, and whew, we were very blessed and very lucky at the time. All right, we're going to take another break and be right back with spine surgeon Dr. Colin Haines with Virginia Spine Institute to talk about ways to prevent back injuries. Stay with us. Welcome back, and we're talking with spine surgeon Dr. Colin Haines with Virginia Spine Institute about ways to protect your back from injury. And we talked about, a lot of protection measures. What are the most common back injuries that you and other doctors see?
When it comes to the neck and the low back, the weak point in general is the disc. And the disc itself, it's the shock absorber. It's the part that separates one bone from another. It's almost the analogy I like to think of, if you're in your car and you drive over a pothole, chances are you're going to pop a tire and not break the axle. And it's the same thing with your spine. Because the disc itself is mobile, it's more likely that that is going to be injured because it's the weak point. Now, the symptoms you can experience with disc injuries and disc pain can be neck or back pain, so localized right to the spot of the injury, or if a disc herniates or squirts out and causes pressure on a nerve, it can cause shooting arm pain or leg pain, tingling, numbness, or even weakness.
So what should people do when they experience back and neck pain? Should they do ice or heat or back and forth, Tylenol, or just go straight to the ER? What's your recommendation?
That's a wonderful question, especially when it comes to ice and heat. That's a question I get all the time. In general, ice tends to be better early. The whole premise and the whole way that ice works is it decreases inflammation. It cools things down and decreases inflammation, which is the swelling that causes a lot of the pain. So in general, for the first day or two, ice tends to be preferable to heat. Heat usually is better a little bit later, a couple days after the fact, because the whole way the heat works is it dilates the blood vessels, increasing the blood flow. It helps to do some actual healing. Now, ultimately, tell people whichever one feels better. There are certain circumstances where heat feels better than ice early, but in general terms, ice first, heat later. As far as your next question on saying, well, when do I get this checked out? There's a little bit of the common sense test that applies. There are certain red flags, we call them, that we look out for. That's if people have seriously bad shooting pain, numbness, or especially weakness. Those are somewhat red flags that we look for that says, hey, get in sooner rather than later. If it's something that gradually gets better over a couple of days and the pain seems relatively controlled, that's usually something that's worthwhile taking some anti-inflammatories as long as it's safe for you and trying some ice before you call your doc or the ER. But in general terms, if there's a question in your mind, if something doesn't feel right, call your spine doc, call your PCP, get in seen by urgent care sooner rather than later, because the sooner we get you answers, the faster we get you feeling better.
And obviously, rest. Don't go back onto the pickleball court or whatever else you were doing right until you feel better. Am I correct?
There's no ego when it comes to injuries. If you're hurt, the smartest thing to do is slow down.
Yeah. And then, so talk about some of the treatments. We see with this opioid crisis that so many people get hooked on these opioids after having back injuries. Back injuries are so prevalent as far as leading people to that. What is your reaction to that? And what can you add to that conversation?
Yeah, the wonderful news, and people ask this all the time, I'm a spine surgeon, but the vast majority of what I do while I do a lot of surgery is actually non-surgical treatment of the spine. About 90% of spine injuries, people get over. We get this cleared up without surgery and get people back to the normal, active, functional lives they want. Now, the good news also is whether it's with or without surgery, pretty much do that in general without opioids, without the narcotics, without the addictive medications. They have their role in the short term, but long term, studies show that they're not overly effective for managing pain because our bodies build up this tolerance to it. And then we end up needing to give more and more medications to achieve the same results. So oftentimes, as long as it's safe, and there are a couple of reasons, make sure you check with your primary care doc about why you might not be okay to take an anti-inflammatory, but ibuprofen, naproxen, Aleve, those medications actually tend to be the first line that we give to help alleviate symptomatology.
That is just really a huge statement that you just made. I was wondering if you could make it again about, the opioids really not being as effective long term. A lot of people do not realize that or even believe that.
Yeah, so when someone takes a medication, an opioid, if they've never had any opioids beforehand, gives them a bump to their pain about here. But over time, the body catches up. So then, once you have developed a tolerance, you need to take more, and the body catches up. And then that phenomenon keeps going. So we see the natural history of people who take chronically opioids is this sort of game of catch up, which requires more and more medications.
You can see why so many people get addicted. All right. Well, on that note, we're going to take our final break and be right back with Dr. Colin Haines, a spine surgeon with Virginia Spine Institute. Stay with us. Welcome back, and we're continuing our discussion with Dr. Colin Haines, a spine surgeon who is discussing all the non-surgical ways to heal back injuries. Can you talk about the other types of ways?
So while most of the time back injuries, neck injuries, disc herniations get better without surgery, there are times that interventions are needed. Well, once upon a time, the only option was a fusion, or basically putting a spine and having it grow together as one solid piece. Problem with that is our bodies want to move. Nowadays, we have disc replacements, which are wonderful treatments. We're not fusing people with knee arthritis. We're doing knee replacements to keep the body moving. And the same thing in the spine. We have low back and neck disc replacements. Another really exciting thing is actually a field of what we call regenerative medicine, stem cell therapy, using someone's own healing cells and own healing tissues to actually heal injured areas and nudge them in the way of back to health. So really, really exciting time of spine because we're more effective, but also able to do stuff less invasively.
I love to hear about all these exciting new advances. All right. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Haines, we're out of time, but we definitely appreciate all your expertise and the advice that you've given us. I'd love to get all that free medical advice. Can you tell our viewers where they can find out more about you?
Yeah, there's more free medical advice on our website, spinemd.com. Also, I put a ton of tips and tricks on Instagram itself at Colin Haines, MD.
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you for joining us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week. Bye now.